It's hard to pinpoint when humans first harnessed the springy properties of wood for ranged weapons. However, many researchers link the bow's widespread use to the Mesolithic era and the so-called hunting crisis. The dwindling populations of large herd animals forced people to turn their sights to birds and smaller game. And as we know, humans wouldn't be humans if they didn't try to improve their inventions. The bow's evolution took many paths. In some cases, power was increased by scaling up the weapon's size, as seen with the English longbow or the Japanese yumi. In other cases, combining different materials with unique properties led to composite bows, often used by nomadic cultures. But as early as antiquity, there was an attempt to address some of the bow's inherent flaws in a radical way, by merging it with a wooden stock. This innovation simplified usage and provided a ready-to-fire weapon. However, this came at the cost of reduced rate of fire and increased size. What we now call the crossbow, though intended as the next step in the bow's evolution, became something entirely different, a weapon in its own right. Today, we'll address some common myths and debatable points often found in discussions about this fascinating weapon. Almost every article about them starts by saying they were much easier to learn than bows. Some even claim it only took an hour or two to train someone to shoot a crossbow, compared to years of practice required for archery, often starting in childhood. While there's some truth to this, it's not that simple. Even if you hand an average person a modern rifle, they won't become a good shot in just a couple of hours. And rifles are easier to aim and shoot, with bullets that travel in a straight line. A crossbow bolt, on the other hand, only flies relatively straight for 10 to 20 meters, even when fired from a powerful crossbow. Beyond that, gravity causes the bolt to drop, while it also loses speed, initially around 8 to 10 times slower than a rifle bullet. This means that when firing at targets beyond a few dozen meters, a crossbowman must account for elevation and if the target is moving a substantial lead. The only way to master these adjustments is through regular, prolonged practice. However, in battles, accuracy often took a back seat. On the battlefield, the goal wasn't precision, but creating a dense rain of bolts or arrows aimed roughly at enemy formations. Archers often used basic, fletching-free arrows because it didn't matter if they strayed slightly off course. The main objective was to saturate the enemy's position with projectiles. A crossbow's maximum range is achieved when fired at a 45-degree angle, making precision less critical in field battles. However, for sieges, small skirmishes, or hunting, accuracy was invaluable. Training someone to fire in arcs with a bow or crossbow wasn't overly difficult, provided they were physically strong. When it comes to shooters aiming for decent accuracy, it's generally easier to train a crossbowman than an archer, but we're talking about months of practice, not hours. And as for elite marksmen capable of incredible precision, they require years of regular training, whether they use a bow or crossbow. Still, crossbow tensioning systems like stirrups, belt hooks, or levers significantly reduce physical strain. Using a war bow, however, is exhausting and demands strong back muscles. Speaking of common crossbow myths, nearly every discussion mentions the Second Lateran Council of 1139 and the Church's ban on crossbows. Many see this as evidence of the crossbow's unparalleled effectiveness, but the original decree says something like this: "We forbid, under anathema, the murderous art of crossbowmen and archers, hateful to God." It's important to remember that this was the 12th century, and knights' armor consisted mostly of chainmail, plate armor, and brigandines came later. At the time, both crossbow bolts and arrows could indeed threaten knights, and knights weren't just warriors, they were also landowners. Considering the ongoing struggle of medieval towns for independence, it's clear this ban served the interests of the feudal elite. Interestingly, the same council also banned knightly tournaments, decreeing that those killed in such events would be denied a church burial. Yet crossbowmen and tournaments only grew more popular after this. Let's address the popular claim that a peasant with a crossbow could easily defeat a knight. In reality, a proper crossbow with composite or later steel prods was far from cheap. It was more of a weapon for well-off city militia or mercenaries, not peasants. Interestingly, English longbowmen were often recruited from the peasantry across the kingdom, while Genoese crossbowmen typically came from the free city population. When comparing bows and crossbows, the Battle of Crécy in the mid-14th century often comes to mind. English archers demonstrated superiority over Genoese crossbowmen, but the situation wasn't so clear-cut. The French forces were incomplete, as the English had disrupted part of their army's crossing. Plus, it had rained shortly before the battle. Reloading crossbows on wet ground was tricky. Some researchers argue that wet bowstrings, which lose effectiveness, were harder to remove from crossbows than from longbows in such conditions, though this is debated. Additionally, the Genoese, likely due to the lack of a supply train, were left without their large shields, pavises. In reality, a crossbowman's advantage wasn't just about the weapon's power and range, but also the protection offered by those tall shields. At that time, the Genoese were still using crossbows with composite prods and mostly basic cocking mechanisms. Steel prods and cranks wouldn't become widely popular until the 15th century, by which point early handheld firearms were already emerging. The pavise shield protected crossbowmen from enemy arrows, an advantage seen, for example, during the Battle of Coutances in the 1346, or at the Battle of Najera in 1359. English longbowmen were completely powerless against pavise shields. The irony is, at the Battle of Najera, they managed to repel a cavalry charge but couldn't handle infantry equipped with pavises, and Genoese crossbowmen, often clad in better armor, generally outclassed the English archers. The main advantage of longbowmen was their rate of fire. I've also come across plenty of comments about so-called solid metal crossbow bolts. I couldn't find examples of such bolts in museum collections or serious works on the subject, but here's something interesting. The shafts of crossbow bolts were often made with reverse tapering, which reduced the chance of them getting stuck in shields. There are plenty of misconceptions about the capabilities of crossbows. It's important to understand that overall, crossbows had slightly better penetration and range compared to longbows. However, it's naive to think that a crossbow with a draw weight of 90 kilograms was 3 times more powerful than a longbow with a draw weight of 30 kilograms. The speed and range of an arrow or bolt depend on factors like the draw length, limb recoil speed, and other mechanics. Heavier limbs, for example, lose more speed when recoiling, so a typical composite crossbow didn't massively outperform a well-crafted warbow. For such comparisons, people often pick a late heavy crossbow with steel limbs and an English or German windlass. But this bulky weapon weighed around 7 to 8 kilograms without the windlass and could fire just 2 shots per minute. It was far better for sieges than open-field battles. There are no grounds to claim that a crossbow bolt could penetrate late medieval plate armor. Even crossbows with draw weights exceeding 400 kilograms failed to penetrate breastplates. That said, armor quality and thickness varied widely in the Middle Ages, so it's also wrong to claim that plate armor made wearers entirely immune to crossbow bolts. There's a theory that the rise in popularity of steel crossbow prods in the 15th century wasn't because they were inherently superior, but rather because advances in blacksmithing made it easier to mass-produce metal parts than to craft composite prods. The latter required painstaking layering of different woods, sinew, and horn. It's also worth mentioning that while crossbows are often seen as always ready for action, leaving them cocked for long periods isn't great for the limbs or string. Steel prods in particular are notorious for becoming brittle and breaking in cold weather. The crossbow wasn't better or worse than the longbow, it was just different. Easier to pick up, less demanding on your muscles, and great for shooting from cover. The downsides: bulk, weight, and a firing speed that made longbows look like machine guns.